Kubernetes is the standard. And eventually, like anything else, it will be replaced by some other standard, but we don't have that on the horizon right now. So you might just as well adopt it instead of trying to figure out your own standard.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 268. What is Kubernetes used for? This episode of DevOps Paradox is brought to you by Barbaro Mojo. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darin and Viktor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darin reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Viktor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darin Pope and Viktor Farsic. Viktor, it is not surprising to people that have been listening to us that you are all in Kubernetes, and I am nowhere near in learning how to spell Kubernetes. Well, that's not exactly true, but pretty close.
That's okay, because I don't think that Kubernetes should be something used directly by majority of people. There are many, many things that our lives depend on, and there is no strong reason why people should be in it. Like, hey, are you into kernels? You're not. Do you use them? Oh, hell yeah.
So what is Kubernetes really used for? What's some real life? Obviously, you work in a open source project that is built on top of Kubernetes. That's your day job.
Depends whom you ask, right? Some people will tell you that Kubernetes is a thingy that runs your containers. That's it, right? That's what it is. It is glorified Docker. It is Docker running in a cluster instead of on a server, on a single node. That's completely wrong, right? At least I believe it's completely wrong, or that's completely missing the point. My explanation of Kubernetes would be that it is a platform that tries to standardize API and enable us to extend that API. And that led to an explosion of tools. And I don't only mean explosion of tools that are enabled through Kubernetes, but that standardization led to everybody finally saying, okay, this is amazing. And I'm now talking as a vendor or person behind the project. This is amazing. Finally, I can develop my dream tool. I can finally develop whatever I wanted to do, and I know where it's going to run, right? And where it is going to do something, and how are people going to interact with that something. We did not have such a possibility before, right? Before Kubernetes, if you would be working on a tool, you would say, okay, I need to figure out what is going to be an interface that people are going to interact with this something, right? I need to develop that. Where is it going to run? Oh, is it going to be running in Linux? Is it going to be running in Windows? Is it in cloud? Where is it? And a bunch of other things. Now we know we have the answer to all those things, and that answer is Kubernetes. And that makes a lot of things so much easier, right? Because you as a vendor, you can say, okay, now I know a lot of things. Now I'm not competing. Now I'm not trying to figure it out myself. I just need to build on top of it. We never had something like that. We never had a platform where that is not necessarily going to be end user platform, but platform that is going to be base for everybody else.
It's interesting how you said we now have a platform. I want to extend that. just like you can with Kubernetes. It's an open platform. We know what those interaction points are. It's not behind a paywall that I have to send people money to figure out how to do something. If there is a distribution of Kubernetes, it has to conform to the specs of whatever the version is, correct?
Exactly. So here's a simple example. Let's say that you are a vendor, you have a project, and that your goal is to be able, for people to be able to run that something in AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, and on-prem. What are your options today?
There are zero to do that other than Kubernetes.
Exactly. And I simplified it here because I said, okay, 3 cloud vendors and on-prem. I did not say, and the operating system could be Windows or Linux, and this, and that. We both work for vendors, right? We both experience that pain of, okay, going to a customer and say, okay, now tell me, what are you using in your system, right? Tell me how much pain I'm going to be in to try to run this thing for you. Now that's more or less gone, okay? We assume Kubernetes, and eventually we might be building the possibility to run this somewhere else as well, and that's fine, but that's a secondary importance, right? This is the first time in history of computing, or maybe second time, right, after mainframes, that we know what potential users are using and how to make it run there, how to make you interact with it, and so on and so forth.
So the number one thing that Kubernetes is used for is to simplify installation of third-party software to run within an organization. Did I take it too far?
Yes, no, that's true. To simplify running third-party software, exactly. I would say that's probably that's of course not the only usage, and software can be many things. Just to clarify, usually when you say software, people think, okay, my application, but that software could be a solution for networking, solution for storage, right? It could be many different things. But yeah, what you just said is right, and I feel that that's not how people see it, right? People are focused more on what they do, like, hey, my applications, right, in a company. But that ability to develop as a third-party solution is what made it explode. It's what made it bypass not only its direct competitors, but basically anything. We never had such a big adoption of anything in this industry before. Maybe browser would probably be the only comparative example, right? Browser also got such a big adoption, if you're developing some graphical user interface today, right? It's browser. Well, what else is there? Nothing else, except if you're on iOS and then you cannot run web-based applications.
That's a different conversation. Let's not go down that rabbit hole. So if my first statement is true, running third-party applications or software, not applications, but software, what's something else that Kubernetes can be used for? You've, I think, sort of mentioned it. Let's just use Kubernetes for being the brains, being what it is a control plane. Anything beyond the control plane is an implementation detail, correct?
Yeah, that's what Kubernetes enabled us, right? That through those third parties, or if we are very big by ourselves from scratch, building that solution, right? I am personally into control planes. That's my thing. The only logical place how to develop something that would a project that would act as a control plane is Kubernetes. Somebody else might be to networking. The only place where you can develop a networking solution today, actually that's wrong, not the only place, but the only place that gives you return of investment and say, I can reliably say significant percentage of my users are there. That would be, again, Kubernetes and so on and so forth. We have friends from Kasten, let's say. They develop storage. How? Well, Kubernetes, right? Not storage as physical storage, but software for storage. So Yeah, and then Kubernetes itself, from the end user perspective, becomes alpha and omega, right? You need to run your applications. You're going to run them in Kubernetes. And here comes the important part. Or you're going to manage them, and you're going to manage them through Kubernetes, right? Basically, whatever you need to do, you're going to do it through Kubernetes. And I chose my word now carefully. I said through, not necessarily in, right? We are still not clear where our processes are going to run, because there are many advantages why they would be Kubernetes, but there are also advantages why that should be Google Cloud Run or Azure Container Apps, which happens to be Kubernetes as well, or whatever is Lambda in Google and so on and so forth, right? Sorry, Lambda in AWS. So we are not even though majority of people see Kubernetes as primarily as a place where you run your processes, your applications, that's actually still shaky. That we are not sure about that still, right? But then Kubernetes is being some sort of a base where you run all the tooling and all the other processes that you might be having. That is almost a decided thing, right? And you can see that simply through all the projects that are appearing, and vast majority of them being Kubernetes first, if not Kubernetes only.
Well, look at the other side of that. Not just the Kubernetes only. How about Kubernetes never? The applications within my organization, I don't care about them running Kubernetes. I'm running a .NET app that needs to run on a Windows machine because I need all 3,000 cores that are available on that machine all the time because it's running all the time. That would make sense to run in Kubernetes, right?
Let's say that for the sake of argument that, yeah, you're not going to run that in Kubernetes, but you're going to manage that through Kubernetes. However, you are instructing what that application should do and how it should react and how it should be deployed. It's most likely going to be through Kubernetes, right? If you're going to run your own pipelines, they're going to run in Kubernetes. If you're going to have some kind of policies, those policies are going to be in Kubernetes and so on and so forth, right? So it is a control plane. And in this context, when I say control plane, I don't mean control plane from the perspective of the project I'm involved in, cross-plane. I mean control plane meaning anything, right? Oh, you're gonna adopt GitOps and your application does not happen to run in Kubernetes. Excellent. You're still going to use Kubernetes, right? So yeah, your application might not be there, but everything else is. And here's the reason for that. Third parties, right? If you see a fancy new project, that project is either has a mechanism to run in 57 different places, or if it has an option to run in one place, that one place is Kubernetes.
So in theory, my quote-unquote Kubernetes cluster could just be a control plane and no worker nodes.
You need worker nodes, but not necessarily worker nodes for your application, but worker nodes for those controllers, for those processes that control things, right? Because you still need a process. Whatever you're controlling, that something is controlled through bits and bytes, right? So that they need to run there, but not necessarily your applications.
So what you're telling me, you know I was going to go here. What you're telling me is Kubernetes is nothing more than Jenkins with connected agents.
Yes, I can actually, logically speaking, conceptually, yes. Jenkins is an example of a control plane. You would use Jenkins. Jenkins would be connected to everything in your system, and you would use it as a place that manages all sorts of operations. Yes.
Manage, and your word there is what matters. Manages. It's not actually doing the work. It's delegating that work down to a connected agent. In Kubernetes world, that's a worker node. And the real work, if you will, happens on the worker nodes.
Yeah, exactly. There is a big difference between managing something. I call that today control planes, right? But we can have different names. And where ultimately your application is running. Jenkins is for the first part. It manages things. It performs some operations, right? It can perform any type of operations. And whatever you need, like you need to build this thing, excellent. You need to run this thing. And I don't mean physically run. There is a difference between the destination. Okay, so my application physically will be running there. But the process that is going to run it or stop it or restart it or configure it or make sure that it's running, yeah, that would be Jenkins.
For everybody that's listening that's not a Jenkins person, you're saying, you're crazy. Viktor just proved I'm not crazy. Now, is it as Jenkins, the open source project, is it as scalable as the control plane within Kubernetes? The answer is no. Jenkins is a single running process, whereas the control plane for Kubernetes can scale out to, I don't know you would ever do infinite. Is there ever a time? What is an upper limit for the control plane, do you think?
For the number of worker nodes?
The number of control nodes.
People rarely use more than 3. You might go 5, but if you need more than that, you're looking into having a different new cluster, right?
You just skipped right over it. People look at 3 or they look at 5. Why do they look at 3 or they look at 5?
Because it must be more than 1 and it must be an odd number.
And why must it be an odd number?
Because if something happens to a controller node or control plane node, you need to continue having a quorum, meaning that majority of decision makers, each of those nodes are like decision makers. Think of them as maybe a parliament where every decision can be made only by majority votes, right? So you can never lose majority, meaning that you always need to have at least one vote over 50%. That means that if you have less than 3, 1 going down, you lose more than 50% of possibility, right? Because you're literally going to be on 50%. 3 gives you that sweet spot. 1 can go down and you still have the majority, meaning that 2 out of 3, more than 50%, can agree on something, right? Can reach a consensus and say, okay, we agree by majority vote that this thing is a thing. Let's go and commit to it, right? So it's always an odd number because that just makes more sense, right? It makes no sense to have more than 3 unless you expect the situation in which more than 1 fails. So if you never expect more than 1 node to fail, then it doesn't make sense to have more than 3. If you expect more than 1 node to fail, let's say 2 control nodes to fail at the same time, then 4 doesn't make sense because that would again mean that you would lose the majority.
It's what we call from olden times split brain. We never want to get into a split brain scenario.
Exactly.
Go Wikipedia the phrase. It will make more sense.
The funny part, at least if you're talking about it from the Kubernetes perspective, is that also becomes more or less irrelevant today. Because for majority of people, you don't know how many control plane nodes you have. Admit it. You have no bloody idea. Right? Because if you're setting it up yourself and not only using it, and if you're doing it literally by yourself in your own data center or something like that, then you know. Otherwise, if you're using cloud, you have no idea because you're using a managed service. You don't know. Maybe there are 1,000 control plane nodes in your cluster. You have no idea, and you will never find out. Somebody else takes care of it.
And you don't care, or you shouldn't care.
No, you shouldn't care. Why would you care? Right? That's why I'm paying for the service. The same way as there are many things I don't know and I don't care about when I order something in a restaurant. I'm not really going into, okay, so how did you get this cow, right? What was the color of the cow? And so on and so forth. I ordered a burger. I want a burger. That's what I want. Don't give me the story about how it took 5 years of work to get to it.
Well, it's interesting that you brought up a restaurant because, you know what? You probably like some hot sauce on your burger.
Oh.
Are you ready to spice up your life while optimizing the hot sauces for your burger? Meet Barbaro Mojo, the delicious Cuban hot sauce with a kick that's sponsoring today's episode. Barbaro Mojo brings the heat with our unique Cuban marinade base, adding an unforgettable flavor to your favorite dishes. With flavors like El Habanero, Halibo, Pinazzo, and Best Day Ever, there's a perfect match for everyone's taste buds. Not only are these hot sauces gluten-free and vegan, but they're also perfect for spicing up your work-from-home lunches or adding an extra kick to your weekend barbecue. Trust me, you don't want to miss out on this chance to taste the best Cuban hot sauce out there. So go ahead and order your bottle of Barbaro Mojo today, and remember to use the promo code DevOps25, that's DevOps, the number 2 and the number 5, to get 25% off your first order. Thanks to Barbaro Mojo for sponsoring today's episode. So we've talked about using Kubernetes for running third-party software. Software is important, not just application software. We talked about it as being just a control plane. What else is Kubernetes used for?
There are many reasons why you might want to use Kubernetes for, but the most common one or most talked about right now would be building your own developer platform, right? That's what everybody's interested in. And that's more or less in line or being almost the same as being a control plane. But the major focus there is you can create your own interfaces, right? If you want to provide something as a service to everybody else in your company, to your developers or QAs or whatever they are, you want to start with the interface first. And this is where I disagree, or many people disagree with me, right? Usually people start somewhere else, start with UI or CLI, or start with whatever is user facing, right? Where we're getting right now is that, or I hope we're getting, is that we start with interfaces. Like almost every good developer for end user applications will tell you. You develop an API, then you create a backend, and then you create a frontend. And backend and frontend can be working even in parallel because they know how to talk to each other, even if that talk is not yet physically possible, right? And Kubernetes is perfect for 2 of the 3 of those tasks, right? If you want to create an API, we have a standard API, we know how to extend it, and everybody's already using it, so why wouldn't you use it as well? Why wouldn't you extend Kubernetes API? If you want to create a backend behind that API, we have a very standardized and easy mechanism to do that. It's called Kubernetes controllers. And then comes the front-end part of the story, right? You want to communicate somehow with that API, and you're not brave enough to use CURL for that communication. You want to build a graphical user interface, maybe browser-based, maybe CLI, maybe VS Code plugin, whatever that something is, whatever you can think of. Excellent, go for it, do it, right? I feel that that's in line with software development in general, right? And I know that people just happen to agree but don't do what I'm saying, but it's always, you define the API first. And then we can go our merry ways that I know how Joe will have to implement the backend behind that API, and Frank or Maria will have to do the front end that talks to that API. That's fine. We create the contract. Kubernetes just happens to be very, very good at doing that. And at the same time, very, very standard way of doing that.
So standardization is what Kubernetes is used for.
That's the keyword. I think if there is a single thing that people should get out of this conversation is that, yeah, Kubernetes is the standard. And eventually, like anything else, it will be replaced by some other standard, but we don't have that on the horizon right now. So you might just as well adopt it instead of trying to figure out your own standard.
Let's go back to mainframe days. So mainframe was the standard. Let's assume that it was, right? Mainframe was the standard. And now we have Kubernetes today as I'm going to say the standard instead of a standard. We can argue about that later. It doesn't really matter. In between those two times, and yes, there's still mainframe today. There's still a lot of mainframe. But, for most of us, we don't see mainframe on a daily basis. What was the standard in between? Be careful how you say this, though, right? Because there's multiple answers, But was there ever truly the standard in between those two times?
No, I feel that that's what we were lacking as industry. We did not have that standard, right? We were all going our own merry ways. Oh, if I just go through my personal history, I had comma-separated files, I was tab-separated files, this REST API, that REST API, gRPC, this or that. We were just figuring it out as we go, right? There was no standard. It was just pick among infinite number of choices. Now we have that standard. That's Kubernetes, right? That's its biggest contribution. I said that in the past, and I'm going to say it again. Kubernetes API will outlive containers. I guarantee that 100%. That's the real value of Kubernetes. APIs and how we can create, I'm going to use non-Kubernetes terms, how we can create backends behind those APIs. Everything else comes and goes.
So if we have our standard now, are we going to go into that wandering in the desert moment again after Kubernetes? Before there's a new standard again?
After Kubernetes will come something else. Somebody will figure out significantly better way to do things, right? That will happen. That always happens. And then we will have Wild West, right? Because then thousands or hundreds or tens of different projects will try to compete in that area. And then eventually we will have another winner. The reason why, going back to what you said before, and I'm paraphrasing, we had mainframe that was a standard, and now we have Kubernetes, and not much in between. I think that the major differentiator now compared to the past is that now a lot is based on open source. And the reason why I'm saying that that's differentiator, apart from the obvious, is that open source is winner takes all type of situation, right? It always starts with an idea. It moves into, now we have dozens or hundreds of ways how to accomplish that idea. Wild West. And then one of them emerges as a winner. And we had that with Kubernetes as well. We had Mesos, we had Docker Swarm, we had Nomad, we had Kubernetes, and that's naming only those that are widely popular. Like skipping things that probably majority of people never heard of, like Tupperware. Have you ever heard of Tupperware, Darin?
Other than the bowls, no, I haven't.
Yeah, that was, the same DockerCon when Kubernetes was announced, when it was a silly bad solution. Among many, many others, I think it was Facebook orchestration was announced as well. It was called Tupperware. There we go. And it disappeared. Right? Nobody even know that it existed, right? What I'm trying to say is that it's not only those 3 or 4 or 5 that I mentioned. It's countless number of similar solutions. But eventually we got to one, right? So yes, after Kubernetes, we'll have another Wild West moment, and then something else will emerge as a winner.
So far, we said there's 3 things that a Kubernetes cluster, or just Kubernetes in general, is used for. We have our running third-party software. We have just using it as a control plane. And the last item that we talked about was using it as the basis for our internal developer platforms.
There is the 4th one, your own software as well. Just to clarify.
Yeah, you can. By the way, you can use it for your own software just because it's there too. But that should have been obvious if it wasn't. I did a really poor job in sort of alluding to that. Is there anything else that it's really good for? I mean, each one of these things we're just barely scratching the surface because we're talking, especially like the second one to me, is using it as a control plane. And you've said it before. I'll reiterate it. That use case is going to outlast all the other things. Just using it as a control plane.
Yeah. Depends how you define control plane. But from a certain perspective, control plane can be anything, right? So if you put into control plane definition things like policies, for example, right? Or synchronization of the artifacts and what's not, then yes, basically with control plane, you're making it such a large bucket that it actually encompasses everything. And then, that's it, right? What does matter is that within that very, very broad definition of, this is a control plane that can run processes that do things, whatever those things are, we have dozens or hundreds or thousands or millions of different use cases.
What do you wish Kubernetes was good to use for?
Oh, that sounded like a question to the audience, not to me.
It is for the audience, but I'm putting you on the spot. Is there something today that you wish you could use Kubernetes for that it does not do today? Or is just, not so much? Is it watching Netflix for you? Is it something else? I don't know.
No, there are things that are not yet there. So, for example, I would really like Wasm to be a real part of that something, right? As alternative to containers. Not saying that containers are bad necessarily, things like that, but Wasm, for example, is an interesting technology that started as being completely outside Kubernetes, and now it is slowly moving, but it's not there yet into Kubernetes, right? So, for example, having the option to let me rephrase it. It's not only Wasm. Having the option to have additional runtimes, but that those runtimes can work seamlessly with the rest of the ecosystem. That would be absolutely amazing. And we have already some attempts in that space, like you can use KubeVirt to run virtual machines, right? There are some options to run Wasm, but we are not there yet. But Wasm would be probably on my list of, I wish I could do it with Kubernetes, but we're not there yet.
Let me ask this question. It'll probably be the final question. If Docker would not have come to the forefront, and more importantly, containers and container images would not have come to the forefront, would Kubernetes have even seen the light of day?
Kubernetes probably wouldn't exist if Docker did not exist. Docker enabled... Actually, two things happened. Docker enabled Kubernetes in a way, even though it's not there anymore, but it definitely enabled it. But also, Docker showed the possibilities or the need for orchestration, right? That was always there, just to be clear. But now, orchestration was very finicky and complicated until we first agree on how we're going to package our applications, right? Because thinking about what is the universal way to orchestrate something without understanding first how we're going to package that something sounds ridiculous, in retrospective at least. Is it going to be zip files? Is it going to be tar files? Is it going to be binaries directly, and so on and so forth? The fact that we overnight almost, because nothing moved as fast as Docker, to my knowledge. The fact that we overnight decided this is the packaging format. And I insist that, to me, Docker is a packaging format first and foremost, right? And we all agree on that, right? Yes? Vote? We voted, it's Docker, right? That enabled orchestration. And Docker itself realized that. Because, now that we know how to package things and we know how to run it on a single node, let's see how we can run it at scale. And everybody saw opportunity in that. And that's how we eventually got Kubernetes, among many, 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 many others.
So we can thank the lowly grouping of tarball files to the explosion of Kubernetes.
Yes. That's also an interesting thing. You know how I said that Kubernetes API is going to outlive the runtime. Now it's containers. Tomorrow will be something else. I think that same thing goes for containers. OCI images are going to outlive container runtime. That's a standard. That's a standard that really matters. It matters much more how I package my code than how I run that code, that package. Tomorrow, we might switch, or not, I mean, some already did, from, let's say, container runtime to WASM. But how are we going to package applications that are going to run as WASM? Well, as container images.
An OCI image is, I guess, the 2000s versions of a zip file, right? Or a tar
Yes.
file.
It's a very fancy, advanced version of, or it's a zip file specialized to package processes and not, it's, going to the other episode we recorded, right? If Helm would be a generic purpose templating and Q is specialized into data. Same thing goes with zip or tar and container images, right? They're specialized to package processes or files that become processes.
But that's not really what we're talking about. I don't know why we went down. I know why we went down that rabbit hole, because I at least wanted to talk about it, because without those things, we wouldn't be having the Kubernetes conversation to begin with. That's my actual strong belief on that. I think I go beyond an opinion on that, and it's a belief. So, what are you using Kubernetes for? Head over to the Slack workspace, go to the podcast channel, look for episode number 268, and leave your comments there. We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.